Hello, I'm Noelle Lim on ASEAN Speaks by Maybank Investment Banking Group. Vietnam delivered strong economic growth in the first quarter of this year, but the road ahead is expected to see some bumps owing to collateral damage from the Russia-Ukraine war and supply chain disruptions from China's numerous lockdowns. Nevertheless, the revised 2022 GDP forecast for Vietnam by Maybank remains decent at 5.8%, down from the earlier forecast of 6.7%. Brian Lee, our economist, tells us what is happening in Vietnam.
If we just look at the headline number, overall GDP growth was 5% in the first quarter, and that's comparable to the fourth quarter of 2021's outturn of 5.2%. But we already see signs sector-wise that growth is beginning to slow in certain segments of the economy, which are more sensitive to commodity and raw material prices. The prices of oil, gas, grain, industrial metals, and fertilizer have surged as a result of the war. So the agriculture sector slowed to 2.4% from 2.9% in the fourth quarter, in spite of relatively favorable weather conditions. And this was due to rising costs of animal feed and fertilizer, which was exacerbated by the war. Fishery growth fell by 1 percentage point as many fishing boats lay idle amid the surge in fuel costs, which made it unprofitable for fishermen to take their boats out to fish. Manufacturing growth still remained robust at 7.8%. That's about the same as 8% growth the previous quarter. But as reported by the latest manufacturing PMI release in March, import costs began to weigh on firms. The output sub-index fell below 50 for the first time in 6 months, indicating a weakening of business conditions. This was partly due to a sharp acceleration in cost pressures, with oil, gas, and raw material prices widely mentioned among firms. The war in Ukraine also delayed supplier deliveries, with suppliers' lead times lengthening by the most since last October. Consumer prices-wise, the prices of transport jumped in March, largely due to the rise in oil prices. Transport inflation accelerated to 18.3% from 15.5% in February. And in month-on-month terms, the pace of increase was twice that of February, all due to the surge in petrol prices. We also saw an increase in food inflation, and housing construction costs rose, still manageable, about 1.7% versus 0.7% in February. This was due to increasing gas, iron, and cement prices, which filtered through to the higher price of housing maintenance materials.
So looking forward, you've cut Vietnam's GDP growth forecast to 5.8% from 6.7% previously in 2022. Could you provide some specifics on how the war will affect Vietnam's economy directly and indirectly, especially when Europe is a significant trading partner?
The war will affect growth through 3 main channels: trade, tourism, and commodity prices. Exports to Russia and Ukraine will be hit directly, though this accounted for just 1% and 0.1% respectively of Vietnam's total exports. Though Vietnam has not imposed any sanctions on Russia, Western sanctions are wide-ranging. There's been a barrage of them. It will hit Vietnam exports because of Vietnam's status as a major production base for foreign MNCs. To give some statistics, foreign investor firms accounted for about 3/4 of Vietnam's exports in 2021. More than half of the FDI comes from Singapore, South Korea, and Japan, and which are countries that have imposed bans on electronics exports to Russia. So just to give some examples of MNCs that have suspended shipments and operations in Russia, Samsung and Uniqlo, both of which manufacture a sizable share of their products in Vietnam. Financial sanctions, as well as refusal of shipping firms to transport goods to Russia, will compound the impact on exports. The war will likely trigger a sharp European Union slowdown, given its heavy dependence on Russian energy imports. The EU is a significant trading partner of Vietnam, with exports to the EU accounting for 12% of Vietnam's total exports. So Europe's slowdown poses sizable downside risk to major exports to the EU, such as telecommunications equipment, footwear, and electronics components. In addition, a prolonged conflict would dampen Europe to Asia travel and take some shine off the highly anticipated tourism sector recovery. European tourists accounted for 12% of Vietnam's pre-pandemic foreign visitor arrivals. Russians just made up 3.5% of all foreign visitors. However, they spend an average of 1,600 USD per stay as compared to $900 for the average foreign visitor, higher than average revenue drivers for Vietnam tourism sector. So high commodity prices will eat into firms' profits across industries. Just to give examples of sectors, agriculture has and will continue to be impacted by the higher cost of fertilizer and animal feed. The transport sector will be hit directly by higher petrol prices. Electricity production has been hit by coal shortages amid poor domestic production and surging imported prices, resulting in the risk of power shortages from in April. Manufacturing will be hit by electricity shortages, as well as surging costs of industrial metals and other raw materials. Construction will be hit by higher input costs like cement and steel. A protracted rise in food and fuel prices will also have knock-on effects on household consumption by reducing the purchasing power for discretionary spending as transport and food expenditure tie up more of consumers' budgets. So just to give a sense, food and transport take up about 33% and 10% of the CPI basket respectively. This means that more than 40% of households' expenditure is actually taken up by food and transport. Lower discretionary spending will impact revenues of consumer-facing sectors like retail, arts, entertainment, and recreation, restaurants, and hotels.
On power shortages, what will the government do?
I believe Vietnam is trying to negotiate with other countries, such as Australia, to ramp up the imports of coal from those countries in a bid to mitigate the shortage.
Some businesses have been beneficiaries of the war, for example, natural gas players with projects outside Russia and Ukraine. Is there any upside from the war for Vietnam?
I think there will be some upside. So surging oil and gas prices may benefit Vietnamese firms involved in oil and gas exploration. That said, exploration activities would be hit by the conflict, especially over the medium term. So state oil firm PetroVietnam said that Vietnam's oil industry relies heavily on Russian equipment, which will be affected by international sanctions. Therefore, the oil industry may face future obstacles and difficulties if no new suppliers are secured. Fertilizer producers could benefit from the jump in global fertilizer prices, and also as Russia and China restrict exports of fertilizers to safeguard domestic supply. This may make local farmers more reliant on Vietnamese fertilizer producers. The steel industry may be another potential beneficiary as exports to the EU could be boosted amid cuts to Russian and Ukrainian steel supply as a result of the war. Some experts have also identified an opportunity for Vietnam to increase exports of agricultural products to the EU to replace the supply disruptions from Russia and Ukraine.
How does the Shanghai lockdown affect Vietnam?
Shanghai is a hub for semiconductors, electronics, and car manufacturing. It's also the world's busiest shipping port. The disruption to factory operations as a result of the lockdown and movement restrictions will have ripple effects on the entire supply chain of China because of interconnectedness between Shanghai and other regions, especially the manufacturing hub of Yangtze River Delta. Container ports are experiencing significantly reduced volumes as a result of staffing shortages and delayed transportation in and out of the ports due to local restrictions. The 7-day average throughput is down more than 30% compared to early March by some estimates. The Shanghai lockdown will exacerbate supply chain disruptions in Vietnam, which has actually already happened because of lockdowns in other manufacturing export hubs in March, like Shenzhen and Dongguan. Shortages and delays of components, as well as increased shipping costs as a result of the supply chain disruptions, could impede Vietnam's manufacturing production. To give some statistics, Vietnam is heavily reliant on intermediate inputs from China. 14.4% share of the value of Vietnam's gross exports originates from China, according to OECD trade and value added data. According to UN data, textile, garment, and footwear imports from China formed 58.2% of total textile imports, while electronics imports from China made up about 35% of total electronics imports. So yeah, there's a significant dependence there. In addition, the lockdowns in Shanghai and also across China will weigh on China's growth, whether it's because factory closures constrain Chinese exports or because movement restrictions impede private consumption, especially services consumption. The manufacturing and services PMI for China, the March release, both whether it's the official or the Caixin versions, have plunged into contractionary territory below the 50 mark. A Nikkei Asia survey reported that economists on average expect China's economy to grow only 5% in 2022, falling short of the official target of 5.5%. Fall in China's growth would in turn impact China's import demand for both final as well as intermediate goods. Vietnam is highly exposed to China's growth. Exposure to China final demand is estimated at 8.9% of Vietnam's nominal GDP. That's the second highest in ASEAN, while Vietnam's value added embodied in China's gross exports is 2.3% of GDP. If we combine these two figures together, this adds up to a substantial 11.2% exposure to China's economy from export linkages alone. Vietnam's top 4 exports to China in 2021 were telephones, computers, electronics and components, yarn, machinery and equipment. These categories are expected to be especially affected by the fall in China growth.
What is the government doing to spur recovery and just continue to attract FDIs?
In the short term, the government passed a 15 billion USD economic recovery package in January 2022. It's equivalent to about 4 to 5% of GDP. And the package will help support households and businesses through these challenging times. 3 highlights of the package: 2 percentage point value-added tax cut for majority of goods and services, which is in effect until the end of this year. This will help defray business costs as well as stimulate household consumption. The second highlight, corporate tax relief for businesses, which will help reduce costs. The third highlight would be a preferential lending policy. So new loans of pandemic hit firms made through commercial banks will disburse from January 2022 till December 2023 will enjoy a 2 percentage point interest rate cut. This is aimed at defraying firms' borrowing costs as well as increasing credit demand to support the recovery. More recently, in early March, as the upside risk to inflation increased because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Vietnamese government has put in place measures to cap the pass-through of global commodity pressures to domestic prices. The aim of the government is to put a lid on local costs such that they try and minimize or mitigate the impact on production and consumption. So there are a few measures, but most notably it approved a halving of the environmental protection tax rate on fuel in a bid to rein in petrol prices. And it has also used the petrol price stabilization fund to try and stabilize fuel prices. The director, actually, news reports reported, I think that the director of the Vietnam's Ministry of Industry and Trade Domestic Market Department said that if petrol prices continue to rise, the government would consider reducing the excise tax on fuel in a bid to further control fuel prices. Ministries have also been instructed to monitor prices of essential consumer goods such as petrol and food closely to ensure adequate supply and keep prices stable. So back to the VAT cut in the budget announced this year, it was actually quite timely. Cut in VAT will contribute to reduce inflationary pressures on goods and services. So, but I think if we look back to 2021, one thing the government did right was to managing to ramp up its vaccination campaign really quickly, from close to 0% fully vaccinated in August 2021 to around 80% in March. Vietnam was able to secure a large supply of vaccines through donations and commercial deals due to the government's active diplomacy efforts, though also because the foreign business community has an interest in boosting Vietnam's vaccination rate to facilitate the reopening of factories. And Vietnam's high vaccination rate has facilitated a shift in treating COVID as endemic, which has in turn allowed the country to reopen safely at a faster pace.
What about longer term measures like the transportation infrastructure sector?
Vietnam's transport infrastructure is far behind many advanced economies. The government has recognized this and targeted to build more than 5,000 kilometers of expressways by 2030, which is, by the way, almost 5 times the current level of around 1,160 kilometers. A key transport project would be the North-South Expressway, that will connect Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City when completed in 2025. In the 2022 economic recovery package or the budget, 34% was actually earmarked for infrastructure development of transport networks, IT, and digital transformation. Although the question is whether the infrastructure program can be implemented in a timely manner given complicated and inflexible public investment procedures and bureaucracy. The government is taking steps to improve its implementation, but I think there's still some way to go if you want to compare to the other regional or especially the advanced economies.
The Vietnamese dong is not freely convertible, and there are some restrictions on remittances of profits. For example, foreigners can only remit dividends once a year. Is this a major hurdle to FDIs?
Not the easiest for foreign investors to get money out of Vietnam. So as you said, the Vietnam dong is not freely convertible. It can't be converted or remitted except for permitted purposes. For example, repatriation of investment proceeds and dividends, repayment of foreign loans. Further, foreigners can only remit dividends once a year. And in addition, companies can only give out dividends if they earn a profit for the year. But that said, I think that these are generally quite reasonable restrictions for foreign investors to navigate as long as they understand the rules. And I think in the broader scheme of Vietnam's many attractive features as a foreign FDI destination, I don't think these regulations are actually a major hurdle to FDI.
It seems like the momentum is growing for Vietnam in terms of FDI, and they might be a beneficiary as China continues to lock down cities. Apart from bureaucracy, what are some immediate and longer term issues Vietnam needs to deal with?
Of course, there are some challenges to attracting FDI, both this year as well as in the longer term. A slowdown in Europe and Russia, triggered by the Russia-Ukraine war, will have some, although limited, impact on FDI. Europe and Russia accounted for only 4% and 0.01% of registered FDI over the past 5 years. Another challenge actually is the limited participation of local firms in supplying components to MNCs. Instead, Vietnam is heavily reliant on China for intermediate inputs, with imports from China accounting for 33.2% of total Vietnam imports in 2021. Failure to diversify might increase the risk of production disruptions for MNCs operating in Vietnam in the future and erode Vietnam's attractiveness as a manufacturing base.
Thank you for these insights. I appreciate your time. That was Brian Lee, our economist on Vietnam. For more details, get his research report from our Market Trade app or contact your trading rep to get a copy. I'm Noelle Lim on ASEAN Speaks by Maybank Investment Banking Group.